Hey everyone, welcome to Off Topic Tuesdays. Today we're going to be taking a look at something that's very near and dear to my heart and something that needs a pretty dramatic fix before Total Warhammer 3, or at least during Total Warhammer 3. I am speaking of the Vampire Counts. So kick back, grab a drink, and let's get into it.
Wow.
Now, if that intro confused you, because the Vampire Counts are actually a pretty good state in the game already, they're very well fleshed out with in terms of legendary lords. They've got a pretty good gameplay going for them. They've already had a pretty recent fix for Total Warhammer 2. I'm speaking about a different topic, and that's one more where it's a bit of a lore focus. So if you're unfamiliar, despite all the legendary lords the vampire counts have, they're not actually really the vampire counts. It's a bit of a misnomer. They have two necromancer lords who are unaffiliated, and then the other three vampire counts are all von Karsteins. So a more lore accurate name really would be the von Karsteins rather than the vampire counts. We are still missing the Lamians, Blood Dragons, Necrarchs, Strigoi, and then there's even small bloodlines on the side too if we really wanted to get into it. But even ignoring them, we are still missing 80% of the bloodlines of the vampire counts, and that's something that I think needs a pretty dramatic overhaul by the third game. Now, if the hamster wheel's already turning for you, you're going to realize this actually kind of leads to a second smaller issue, and that's that if we do all the bloodlines in the game, the bloodline mechanic that's currently in the game becomes somewhat pointless. You've already got all these different factions anyway. But also, two, it again becomes a lore issue. There are some vampire count factions, or bloodlines, I should say, that just utterly despise each other and would never, ever work together. So to have them cooperating would be somewhat asinine. For example, the Strigoi and pretty much everyone despise each other. The Strigoi got screwed over by the other vampire accounts. The other vampire accounts now assume that the Strigoi are monsters. There would be no cooperation amongst those two factions. So it's a little peculiar in the game that we're allowed to get Strigoi, vampire lords taken over from their faction. A second issue that pops up, although one that is somewhat fixable. In fact, one of you, Craig Box, shout out to you, buddy, already put in a suggestion for how it could be overcome, is their positioning. So a lot of the vampire accounts are distinctly in the New World or Old World, which is quite a bit west of the third game setting, right? The only ones that are realistically that far east are really the Lamians. However, because of how the vampire counts operate, it's pretty easy to throw them over to the eastern edge of the map during that campaign and just kind of do a bit of hand waving to explain why they're over there. And we'll get into those more as we delve into each of the factions. But realistically, on the Mortal Empires map, or whatever the third game's going to call its combined map, there's going to have to be a bit more justification for why vampire counts that are distinctly based in those maps are suddenly being moved over to the right. But that's enough tiptoeing around the issue. Let's actually get into it. Starting with the one we already sort of touched on, that being the Strigoi. These are probably the single saddest story in this entire list. To start with, their faction leader, Usharan, was the cousin of Queen Neferata, and if you know your Warhammer lore, you know that being related to Neferata never ever ends well, and of course it didn't end well here. Ushiran tried getting some vampirism going. She kind of screwed him over, so he tried doing it his own way and ended up as a, monstrous looking beast. But it only gets worse from there. As it wasn't just Ushiran's body that was bent and twisted, his mind also got screwed over. So, unlike the other vampires who are very intelligent and thoughtful still, the Strigoi are basically psychopaths. They don't just drink their victims, they devour them. And that goes for anything, living or otherwise. They will full on go after other vampires, which is one of the reasons why the other vampires all went nuts and tried to kill the Strigoi. Um, the lore kind of splits about whether or not Ushiran survives all that, and how CA wants to handle it. I honestly don't care. However, basically what it means though is that the remaining Strigoi leadership are kind of in this trance where they think that they're still leading this beautiful, amazing empire, whereas the reality is they're just being followed by a bunch of cannibalistic crypt ghouls and killing at basically everything around them without even really meaning to. Gameplay wise, we've actually sort of seen the Strigoi in the game. We do have a generic Strigoi lord, as well as a lot of the crypt ghouls and stuff. That being said, there's still a lot of room to flesh them out in a lot of really interesting ways. So, more so than any other vampire race, they have a lot of living units behind them. The cannibalistic crypt ghouls aren't actually dead, they're just, well, cannibals. And the Strigani themselves are often living units. So, you would have this vampire counts faction that actually isn't very vampire countish. In fact, if you've played the Strigoi mod that's out on the Nexus, and I'll link it down below, you have a majority living um, unit roster. The other thing is too is of course a lot of their undead units are nuts, right? You would have a lot of basically lizardman-esque rampages if your units, started to lose too much morale and stuff like that, which could also be a super fun time. And then also, unlike all the rest of the vampires, they're not really interested in world domination. They kind of just want to restore what they once had. So if you wanted to do up a story for them, it'd be a very cool one, right? You'd have the rebuilding of Stragan or Stragani and Morcaine and stuff like that. And slowly building up your territories back into a beautiful, peaceful empire once more, which I think could be kind of a cool and unique trait amongst them compared to literally every other vampire count's bloodline. All right, so finishing out on Legendary Lord potential options, there's actually way too many on this list to possibly get through all of them. I mean, it'll be like a 20-minute video of me just listing names. The big three I would look at would be Vorag Bloody Tooth, Urzin the Unrelenting, and Gashning the Black Prince, with the potential for either Usharan or the Mad Orlok as, other options. Vorag Bloody Tooth is effectively the current leadership of the Strigoi. He's actually a pretty swell guy. He was running away from the von Karsteins who were trying to kill him. A few crypt ghouls jumped in to help him out. He took a liking to them and then decided to just protect them. That became his new empire, was to watch over these little crypt ghouls. He has a cool little lore mix with the greenskins and stuff like that. He goes nuts and tries to kill them all, which I thought was kind of fun. But overall, he's more of an empire builder. He just wants to protect his people and, keep to himself. Urzin the Unrelenting, on the other hand, is essentially Vorag if Vorag woke up on the wrong side of the bed. He also, has his own, crypt ghoul counts and stuff like, or crypt ghoul court and stuff like that. But unlike those ones, he's nuts. Like, he is full on military. He is interested in going after and killing all the other bloodlines. Yeah, he's definitely your aggressor of all the options I got on here. Gashnag the Black Prince is actually a really interesting one, and he's actually available on the mods. I think it's Mixu's Legendary Lords. If you want to try and play him out, he is actually one of these southern border princes. He paid off bards to essentially convince the public that he just got cursed with a monstrous looking body, but he's full on a Strigoi vampire lord. Um, Again, leads an entire living border princes region and does so really nice and gracefully. Like, he doesn't go and hunt all his own people and stuff like that, which is kind of cool and interesting to see. The other two I mentioned, I'm kind of leaving out the list because there's too many sort of loose ends with the lore that I think CA would have to jumble up to get them in. Usharan could be alive or dead based upon old lore versus new lore. And then the Mad Orlok has so many different threads that come off of whether or not they were telling the truth, whether or not they survived, whether or not they killed someone, that it's easier just to leave them off the list. But even still, with three above, you'd have one hell of a roster already. Alright, so next up then, let's move from one cursed vampire bloodline to another cursed vampire bloodline. Only instead of being big, buff, monstrous jocks, let's move on to the tiny little nerds of the vampire counts. I am speaking of the Necrarchs. The Necrarchs are the wizards and thinkers of the vampire counts bloodline. It's the reason you get a research bonus whenever you get your first one of them in the game. They are incredibly weak compared to other vampire counts, but again, they're extremely well versed in magic, like even more so than the normal vampires are, who are already quite talented. But then, more interestingly, they were looking for ways of not having to subsist themselves on living blood. So Wisuran, the leader of their whole faction, was a brilliant guy. He was also a Nagesh worshipper, but he wanted a world where the undead could survive forever. And being a vampire, that wouldn't work if all of the people in the world were converted to vampires because they'd have nothing to feed off of. So he tried to create a manner of which he could just survive on magic itself. Didn't actually work all that much, which is why they all look incredibly, well, they are incredibly frail. They don't just look it, as well as the fact that a lot of them are actually psychopaths. Again, I think the Necrocs are a really cool option because of the fact that they're not so gratuitously powerful in straight up combat. But they've also got a lot of other cool stuff too, right? Like a lot of living people actually come and work with the Necrocs, like mutants and the like, because they know that there's safety there. Other cool things about the Necrocs too is you'd have a lot more of a research focused faction than I think almost any other faction in the game. And then you'd also have a really cool thing where I think loyalty would be one of the things that would get introduced back into their factions. So if you're familiar with the lore of the Necrarchs, a lot of the times they betray each other. Like all of their main characters are essentially have tried or successfully killed another main character within their lore. We'll get into those at the very end, but there's a lot of fun stuff you could do with the Necrarchs. Right, so that's the easy part of the Necrocs down. The hard part's actually figuring out who the hell they'd have for legendary lords. So, unlike every other faction on this list, the legendary lords of the Necrocs could be alive, could be dead, could be this, could be that. There's so many friggin' variables, it's almost impossible to figure out, who and what's going on. So let's start with their leader from the original lore, Wisaran. Rosarin could be dead, killed by Melchior the Ancient, or could be alive, possessing Melchior the Ancient. So, moving into Melchior the Ancient, he could be alive and Melchior the Ancient, could be dead and Melchior the Ancient, could be alive and Wisuran, could be dead and Wisuran. Zacharias the Ever Living could be alive and Zacharias, could be dead, or could be alive and Melchior, could be alive and Wisuran. Those are the three biggest named characters we have for them, and all three of them have multiple options for what they even could be. Um, Another option would be Norgal. He is theoretically dead, given that he went looking for an artifact, and beside the artifact was a pile of burnt ashes, signifying that Norgal, probably was immolated and killed. However, we don't actually know for sure that that was him. So they could potentially be someone that's alive. A more interesting option to me is Dintamaz. He was obsessed with the dead even when the guy was alive, and now that he's dead, he's more obsessed actually with spirits. So he would be a very ghost-based army, which would be unique even amongst the faction itself. So that would be a super fun one to have. And on top of that too, he's not really out and out evil. He's just curious, which could be kind of interesting. Another option would be the Lord de Trois. They are a numerologist, so they are obsessed with the number three, and to them, if they manage to drink from Karl Franz, they will become the new like leader, effectively, of the vampire counts as a whole. They are clearly psychotic, but they're very interesting, and because of their focuses, it's very easy to say, you know, they're going after this person because of this reason, right? Because they're super obsessed with things. Another interesting option would be Mundvard. He was more present in the end times and stuff like that, but he is a distinctly anti-chaos faction. He kind of just wanted to be left on his own and chill out and stuff like that. But when the Glotkins showed up, they made him pop out and start killing fools left, right, and center. He also looks absolutely amazing from the artwork, so he'd be a super cool option too. And the last one, and the one I'm not sure if they would go through with, would be Madame Calfon. She was basically abandoned by her parents because she was immensely powerful with magic even at a young age, and was given away to some mutants. Long story short, the Necrocs found them and turned him into one of the vampires, but she ended up becoming too powerful for the Necrocs to control. Because she's still effectively a child in her mind, she is very immature and stuff, but she's very focused on turning the spirits of Athel Lauren into her own playthings. So she has some unique units exclusive just to her in the Bat Spite and the Spider Spite. Given by the names, you can kind of figure out what they both are. But again, she'd be a very interesting one, and of course, because of her tie-in with Athel Lauren, you'd have very interesting lore implications between her and the Wood Elves. All right, moving on to one of the most stylish of all the available factions on this list, the Blood Knights. So the Blood Knights were started by Abrash. Dude was loyal to Lamia, as well as immensely loyal to Neferata. He was actually willing to die for all of them. However, he wasn't just blindly loyal. He did try to avoid or advise all the other vampire counts that feeding on the mortals within their own empires would eventually lead to conflict. And hey, guess what? Guy was psychic. Of course, after the war, all the vampire counts were driven out of Nehekara. Abadash being one of those ones. He tried desperately to avoid feeding on anyone he could, but after long enough, eventually the bloodlust drove him mad, and he fed on like a whole bunch of people all in one sitting, which just racked him with guilt. So he went off to try and just only go after the guilty, orcs, chaos worshippers, all that kind of stuff, until he eventually fed upon a black dragon, wherein he realized that it cured him of his bloodlust. At that point, he starts his own bloodline, the Blood Dragons, and teaches them all to do the same thing. Blood Dragons are kind of cool. They're not really interested in magic in any capacity, but they are like the apex of physical prowess. And of course, they'd have a huge cavalry focus, being, the literal blood dragons. Um, for named characters, they've actually got quite a few cool options. First and foremost, I would pick Abadash himself. While he'd probably be a little bit too powerful, I mean, you could do some sort of, finger wagging about why he's down on power or something rather. Second one I would pick would be Wallach Harkon. He would effectively act very similar to Abadash. He's also super loyal, super reasonable, and stuff like that. I should mention about Abadash, by the way, if Ushiran and Vlad and Karstein are two of the really good vampire account lords, he's definitely up there with the number three. The guy's super, super honorable. But yeah, so Wallach Harkon would be a second one, which probably would play a little too similar to Abadash, but oh well. Third one's actually already in the game, that being the Red Duke. He would be sort of your evil option of all of the ones there. He's not actually evil because he just woke up one day and decided to be evil, like the game suggests. He actually got dealt a really bad hand and sort of became evil as time went on. But yeah, he would be kind of your evil option of the three ones we've mentioned so far. And then for the fourth one, I would actually do probably Radimir Kotman. He only appears briefly in the lore for the end times, basically to deliver a warning, but he's shown to be pretty powerful, and he has some interesting lore against fighting chaos and even helping mortals, which I think would be kind of an interesting angle to give to him. And because his lore is so minimal, it would also give CA quite a lot of wiggle room to set him up however they feel is most appropriate. All right, and with all the other major bloodlines down, let's finish up on the one I think most people were waiting on, Lamia. Lamia, more so than any other vampire faction, is pretty distinctly evil. They are manipulative, they interfere with everyone else's affairs, they infiltrate societies, they use dishonorable combat tactics. They are pretty bad. Led by Neferata, the Lamians are the ones I think most people associate with the vampire counts. They are a all-lady order. Again, like I said, they use political manipulation to accomplish most of their things rather than direct combat. But when it does come to combat, the Lamians themselves are actually pretty impressive. They're better at magic than all but the Necrarchs, while still being extremely fast and good at dueling. They still have big thralls of minions and stuff like that, though they don't use any zombies or anything else that smells or could offend their senses. Um, Again, the Lamians would be an extremely interesting faction to use from a campaign perspective, right? I mean, whether you wanted to steal the influence mechanic from the High Elves or do something else with them, they would be all about turning everyone else's focuses to stuff that would help them in some capacity, which, like I said, the High Elves' influence seems like a pretty direct slot over. Um, More importantly, they have pretty clear objectives, right? They are all about personal power. So basically, getting the entirety of the world directly under their control is their exact MO. It's what they are all interested in, right? So with them, it would be very easy. You would just have take the Empire under your control, make sure that's all yours. Make sure all the vampire count factions are under your control. Make sure whether or not she wants to bring about Nagesh, find different conversation because she's not truly loyal to Nagesh like Sauron was. But there's a lot of stuff that's pretty obvious with the Lamians to figure out. So then we'll finish out on Legendary Lords, and I'm going to start by blowing most people's minds and saying that I actually kind of hope that Neferata's not one of the Legendary Lords for the Lamians. Simply because of the fact that if she's present, she'll completely overshadow everyone else in her own faction. But there's still enough named characters within the Lamia that she's not actually really necessary anyways. So there's two sort of major characters who are both present in books, as well as two minor characters who are more just mentioned and are a bit more open-ended for CA to handle. I'll start with the minor ones first. One being Lady Kamala. She is an ancient vampire. She's very narcissistic and stuff like that. But one of the things I like about her is she would be more of an anti-vampire unit. Her whole raison d'etre is to hunt down anyone who has gone against what Lamia is trying to do. So in that sense, you'd have a really sort of interesting mechanic where she's still super loyal to Lamia, but on the flip side has horrible diplomatic relations with everyone else. That could be one fun one. The other one I was looking at would be Ementet. She is a little bit less well fleshed out compared to, say, Lady Camilla. Um, the thing is with her though is that she's just kind of normal. She's still super loyal to Lamia and stuff like that, and CA could have a lot of fun fleshing her out in whatever direction they chose. But there's a lot less already written about her to go on. All right, so then the two major characters, starting with Genevieve Dieudonné. Um, she is a vampire, but not really an evil vampire. She's saved Karl Franz from an assassination attempt. She's been involved with a lot of the political machinations and stuff and trying to soften the image of the vampires to the mortals, right? So that there's less conflict between the two of them. Despite the fact that she's vaguely goodish, she actually has the full blessing of the Lamians. They actually go out of their way to make sure she's protected. Um, she is already in the game through some mods and stuff like that, but again, it would be very interesting to see a CA take on her, especially concerning she is a pretty major character in a lot of the lore stuff. The next one of these two, and the one I'm far more interested, is Ulrika Magdova. So Ulrika Magdova is from the same series of books that Felix and Gotrek are from. She was actually one of the lovers of Felix, but at some point she got captured and eventually turned into a vampire. And as much as she still tried to stay with Felix and Gotrek, she was ultimately a vampire, and she realized she would be a threat to them if she stayed around them. So instead, she went off and became basically a good guy. She goes down and hunts down all of the vampires, basically as reconciliation for what happened to her. She would be effectively the Ark in the Black of the Lamians. I mean, she is distinctly antagonistic towards the rest of the Lamians. She's there to try to kill them all. Cool thing about her is A, she's a Kislev, which in terms of game three would slot in nice and peachy, right? You know, you have a cool aspect from that side of things. And also B, she already has quite a lot of lore behind her. This would be one where CA could effectively just paint by numbers and it would still come out really, really good. To separate her out from the other ones, you could give her something like, Lore of Ice or something to kind of lean into her Kislevian nature. And however they want to manage it is cool, but this was one I think should absolutely, absolutely be put into the Lamian roster. All right, so that's all the major bloodlines out of the way. What about the minor bloodlines? Well, we don't know stuff about all of them. In fact, we know very little about almost all of them, but that doesn't matter, and I'll explain why in a little bit. But the ones that we know the least about is there are apparently some vampiric Norsemen somewhere, but we have no information really about them, as well as some vampiric Albion people, but again, basically no information there. Now, we know that there are the Jade Bloods over in Cathay, as well as some vampires over in Ind. We don't know much about either one of those. However, we do know a little bit more about the Cathayan ones than we do about the Inds. The Jade Bloods are extremely poisonous. The reason why they're called Jade Bloods is actually because their blood's made of poison. And even amongst the other vampires, like even compared to the Necrocs, they are the weakest of the weak. Sometimes they actually have to have their prey brought to them just to feed upon it. Unlike the other vampires, though, their forces are essentially all living people. It's just people that happen to worship them for being what they are. Um, they have some really interesting lore going on behind them. One of the things I think is really cool is that their original progenitor would be Heraktic, who was an executioner for Neferata, which I think was a really cool touch. It would give them a kind of a reason for having some conflict going on between there. And the other cool thing is that they actually maintain pretty healthy relations with Cathay themselves. Um, in terms of combat, like I said, the Jade Bloods are phenomenally weak. They would actually be the only faction in the game that I can think of where your legendary lord or your lords period would be your weakest character outright. Um, but as said, they are phenomenally poisonous. Um, basically just touching their victims is usually how they manage to kill them. Um, they're a very, very small faction, not just in terms of lore, but in terms of their actual military presence. Like they are the smallest of the bloodlines that we know of. Um, Although they're still pretty, there could be some fun ways to have them put into the game. If not by CA, then at least give us the option to mod them in. Um, that would be one I'd be super happy to see. But we know almost nothing about the Ind ones apart from what I just mentioned. But it doesn't actually matter that we know so little because the other fifth incredibly minor vampiric bloodline that we know of was the Vampirates. And as I'm sure all of you are aware, they ended up in the game no problem. So there is still hope even for the minor factions to show up down the road. But then this leads to a pretty big question. So if we've only got like just this narrow, tiny little sliver of the vampire counts in the game, how are we supposed to get the rest of them in there? And for this, I'd actually say that we just steal my other idea from the Demons of Chaos, in that you just do much bigger Lord packs, say 4 Lords per pack. So, for example, like all the legendary lord options that we just said for all these available factions, put them into one much more expensive package, throw in whatever bonus units need to go in for that specific faction and put them into the game down the line. And then that way we're not being left with only a sliver of the content that we could have had, but on the flip side, we're not also doling it out in a piecemeal manner that doesn't really make sense for anyone involved. I really do hope, though, that the rest of the vampires are fleshed out because the von Karsteins, as much as they are probably one of the bigger vampire bloodlines, the Lamians have a lot to do with the end times and all that kind of stuff, too, and with a lot of the Eastern factions. So to only have the von Karsteins being in the game kind of limits the vampires' count's influence from a lore perspective. Again, CA is going to do wherever the money leads them to do, but I think that there is a lot of content still on the table for the vampire counts to pick from. I mean, you might think that that's pretty much all that the vampire counts are missing, but for example, even looking at their unit roster, we are still missing Patchworkmen, Undead Trees, Whispering Knells, Morghast, Glowing Ghouls, Eyeless Ones, Draco Leeches, Spider Spites, Palace Dread, Abyssal Terrors, Knockers, Coven Thrones, Swain, Strigani, Vampire Thralls, Charnel Guard, Skeleton Archers, Zombie Dragons, Black Rail Knights, Winged Nightmares, Dread Abyssal Spirit Host, and Bat Spites. Like, there's a lot of stuff still left for CA to implement to throw into the game, and I really hope that they don't just abandon the vampire counts to be, Von Karsteins in a nutshell. Especially with the setting of the game 3. I mean, Lamia for sure needs to be in there because they have such interesting lore. And frankly, even the Necrux, I think, could tie in really well with Return of Nagash and stuff like that if we're going in that direction. It's one of those things where I don't expect CA to hit absolutely every possible thing under the sun, but you know what? You throw in a few units with each sort of bloodline pack, and you know what? You're 90% of the way there. What's left, you know what? The modding community can pick up the slack. Anyways, that is going to wrap it up for this particular video. Stay tuned for later in the week. We're going to have a mod that'll affect your playthrough for no matter who you play as well as next week, we're going to be taking a look at the Demons of Chaos and Nurgle specifically. And as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you all next time.